Hello everyone and welcome back. Within today's lecture, we will be talking about the assessment of social validity trends in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. This is an article, a review article that was published in the European Journal of Behavior Analysis, and the authors are Ferguson et al. And this was published in 2018. This will be important as you'll see throughout the presentation because we will be covering this particular review article along with other review articles or similar review articles that were published prior to this one on social validity. The 6th edition BCABA TCO item that we will be covering within today's lecture is F3, which is to identify and prioritize socially significant, client-informed, and culturally responsive behavior change goals. So the article that we're covering today is actually in response to an article written in 1978 and a few other articles that were written after that. So as I mentioned earlier, the article we're covering today is written in 2018, whereas the original article on social validity was written in 1978 by a behavior analyst named Montrose Wolf. And Montrose Wolf was the person that introduced the concept of social validity into the field of ABA. And he made an argument for the importance of assessing social validity. He basically said that we as behavior analysts should be using subjective measures to evaluate the social validity of applied behavior analytic interventions. And I'll get a little bit more into all of that and what that means. But Montrose Wolf had a vision, and his vision was that ABA should be viewed as humane, caring, and socially meaningful. He was very concerned with the social appropriateness of interventions and how ABA was perceived. Similarly, in 1987, so almost 10 years later, Bear, Wolf, and Risley wrote an article on the 7 dimensions of ABA, which you all read in EAB 3002. That's an article that is very important in the field of behavior analysis, and you won't read it once. I guarantee you'll read it multiple times throughout your time in the ABA courses. But in their article, Bear, Wolf, and Risley, almost 10 years later, also emphasized the importance of social validity. Okay, so this is basically our field just getting started, I guess, with the concept of social validity. So what exactly is social validity? Social validity was something that Montrose Wolf defined as having basically 3 components. So he says that social validity refers to the measurement of the social significance of goals, the social appropriateness of procedures, and the social importance of treatment effects. So I'll go over what each of those are. But the social significance of goals is basically that we need to ensure, and we've talked about this a little bit, but we need to ensure that the the behaviors that we are targeting for, whether it be reduction or for increase, that we are targeting behaviors that are meaningful to that individual, that they maybe will allow them to increase social interactions or increase communication, but it can be anything really. It can increase access to new environments, access to reinforcers. Basically, we just want those behaviors that we are targeting for intervention to be something that will improve the quality of life of that individual that we're working with in some way. We're not just going to select behaviors willy-nilly just because somebody in the environment tells us, or because the client themselves might tell us. There are going to be tons of behaviors that we can look at to target. We need to prioritize those behaviors based off the social significance, and that encompasses many different things. One of them being targeting behaviors that will improve the person's quality of life, or that will produce some meaningful change in their life. Okay, so that is the first one. Next is not only targeting behaviors that are appropriate to target or that will improve their quality of life in some way, but rather that we are then selecting interventions in an appropriate manner. Okay, we want socially appropriate interventions. And how do we know what's socially appropriate? We have to have some sort of measure to determine what is socially appropriate for that particular client and for their caregivers or their stakeholders. And there are different ways of assessing the social appropriateness of an intervention, but that could be something as simple as, getting context on the caregiver's, time, what can they manage most effectively, asking a client simply, how do you feel about this intervention? Is this something that you feel comfortable with? Determining whether the intervention is appropriate in a particular setting or not. Because let's say, for example, that we're intervening in a classroom and we're expecting a teacher to dedicate 3 hours to implementing an intervention, but she has 20 students to split her attention, across. Or we might be implementing an intervention that makes us a client feel uncomfortable in a particular social setting. Maybe it's not an intervention that's appropriate to deliver across multiple people. We just have certain considerations that we want to make in terms of whether an intervention is appropriate for the particular context. We can take into consideration culture, the client's needs, what caregivers can reasonably implement, or the therapist can reasonably implement, or whoever the teacher, whoever it is that's implementing the intervention. There are many different considerations, but the important factor is that we are measuring the appropriateness of that particular intervention. And then finally, we want to also measure the importance, the social importance of our treatment effects. Is this treatment going to produce a significant behavior change for that client, something that's going to be effective and really produce some meaningful change in their behavior, and improve their quality of life in some way? What about for the community? Is there some benefit to the community or to the immediate family or the extended family? Those are all considerations that we would want to make. So in very simple terms, social validity just refers to the measurement of how acceptable and meaningful our interventions are to their stakeholders, the clients, and to society or the community. So why exactly then is social validity important? Well, Montrose Wolf was very concerned with the social acceptability of our interventions. He wanted to make sure that our interventions were perceived in a positive light, that ABA as a field in general was perceived in a positive light. And obviously that's very important. But also it's very important for us to have a client-centered approach, that we are considering our clients' needs, that we are aligning with our clients' values, their cultural needs, etc. So if we have a socially valid intervention, then that means that, or just a socially valid program in general, then that means that we are ensuring that our goal selection, our intervention selection is going to align with our individual client values and their individual cultural needs, their environmental needs, etc. And when we do this, right, when we tailor our interventions to our client and their needs, then that means that we are setting that client up for success. We're more likely to get buy-in from the caregivers, from the people that will be implementing the intervention, whether it be a teacher, the parents, a nanny, whoever it is. If we take their individual opinions, values, etc. into account, and we tailor our interventions in a way that they feel that they can reasonably, implement, then they're more likely to implement our interventions consistently. And if we have consistent implementation, well, then guess what? We're likely to see better effects with our interventions. Because if we don't have buy-in from our caregivers, from our stakeholders, it can make it doesn't mean that you don't have an effective intervention, right? If you don't have consistent implementation, you're not going to see the effects that you're expecting to see. It's not that your intervention is good. It is not good. It's just that your intervention wasn't something that could be reasonably carried out by the people that you're expecting to carry that intervention out. And so if we tailor our intervention to our client's particular needs, to the implementers' needs, then we'll be able to have a more effective intervention. obviously, this doesn't mean that we're not going to use our evidence-based approaches or our research, our heavily researched interventions. You're still going to conduct those evidence-based approaches. You're not going to do like a willy-nilly ABA. That's not what we're doing here. We're still going to conduct high quality, good quality ABA. It's just you're tailoring it to your client's needs. And then the other benefit that this has, of course, is not just that you are benefiting your clients. You're going to have much better outcome with your clients, but you will also be improving the quality of our field. ABA as a whole has, unfortunately, had a history of, I think most fields, when they get started, have their I guess there's stories of things that are not so positive or not great. Well, in ABA, we have many autistic individuals that have come out that have, gone through ABA for many years in their life. And they have said that they feel that ABA was traumatic, that it was abusive, and I'm not going to negate that. I think it's possible that they experienced very low quality or poor quality ABA. There are many people that practice ABA, quote unquote ABA, and they're not doing actual ABA interventions. They've kind of gone rogue. They're not using evidence-based practices. They're just doing whatever, they feel is appropriate, or maybe are using punishment-based interventions, and they're not following the ethics code, whatever it might be. It could be many different factors contributing to this low quality implementation of ABA. But if we as a field do a better job with making sure that our interventions are not only evidence-based but also socially valid, then we can help to address those concerns that have been brought up by the anti-ABA movement. And our field won't be perceived as such rigid or impersonal, field, but rather a field that takes a client-centered approach and still produces effective behavior change, right? Like we want to continue to be a science and evidence-based field. We want to, and be data-driven, but that shouldn't be at the expense of like someone's experience, I guess. We should still take into account people's perception of the interventions that we're implementing, their experience with ABA. We should want them to have a positive experience and like I said, improve their quality of life. We don't want ABA to be detrimental or contribute in any form to somebody's trauma. So we as practitioners have, I think, a big weight to carry or a big burden to carry. We should be tailoring our interventions to our clients' needs. We should be considering how our interventions are affecting our clients, but also making sure that we have our, like a data-driven approach and then we're producing effective behavior change. So anyways, as Montrose Wolf wanted us to, by engaging in socially valid interventions, selecting behaviors that are socially significant, then hopefully behavior analysts will be able to find their heart in their practice, meaning that we'll be able to be more compassionate and more caring towards our clients that we work with. And that's one thing that I would like to see in the field. I think you can appreciate the science of ABA and you can still implement the science of ABA while also taking into account your individual client needs, their values, their culture, their cultural needs. It's not like you have to do one thing and not do the other. Rather, a combination of those two things would be best for your clients. So why exactly, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but why exactly does perception matter in an evidence-based field? Well, as I mentioned, ABA is a science-based field. We are evidence-driven field. And so we do rely very heavily on data and research to guide our practices. However, being evidence-based on its own, is not going to be enough. We need that public trust and acceptance in order to ensure that we are getting some successful implementation of our interventions. If we don't have buy-in, if we don't have, if I walk into a classroom and immediately the teacher tells me, I have no interest in collaborating with you, you are a behavior analyst, what you do is abuse, what you do produces trauma to my clients, how will I ever be able to support that client in that environment? I won't be, because there's a negative perception of ABA, not just maybe by the individuals that have experienced ABA, but it could also affect other practitioners that we come across, other professionals that we come across. So I have seen, for example, I haven't experienced it myself, thankfully, when I've practiced in the field, but I have seen many SLPs, speech language pathologists, that are opposed to collaborating with behavior analysts. And I think in recent years, behavior analysts have done a very good job of trying to collaborate more with other professionals, like occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, school psychologists, teachers, etc. We've done a much better job of trying to collaborate with those professionals, not overstep, not come in guns blazing and say, I know better than you and I know exactly how to solve this problem, but rather listening and asking what is going on, how can I support you, how can we complement each other, things like that. If everybody, let's say all of these professionals that I just mentioned, speech language pathologists that is working with the client, an occupational therapist that's working with the client, the teacher that's working with the client, if all of these individuals have a very poor perception of behavior analysis and the field as a whole, guess what's going to happen when I walk into a room and I try to get them to implement interventions that I know will be effective or I believe to be effective? They're not going to want to implement anything. And my client won't reap the benefits of our field, of the science that we know can help to improve the quality of their lives. And so perception is incredibly important in our field. But, just because we're going to focus on addressing social validity does not mean that we're, like I said, not going to implement our data-driven interventions, right? That we're not going to focus on the data. The data will drive our practice. The data is going to be how we make decisions on whether to move on or continue with an intervention, but also, how a person feels, or perceives an intervention, or whether they can reasonably implement an intervention in their setting, or whether they feel that it fits into their cultural values or not. That also is going to be a consideration as to whether we decide on modifying an intervention or not. It's not just going to be the data, but it's going to be these other factors as well. So as I touched on, our perception of our field is going to influence the collaboration and the advocacy for our field. If we have a positive perception, it's going to strengthen our opportunities for collaboration with different professionals. If our field is perceived in a negative light, not only will that impact, like the collaboration with professionals, but also specific clients or potential clients may not reach out. They're not going to want to implement ABA or seek out ABA services for their children or for themselves. Okay, so having a poor perception of our field is also going to impact our access to services, not our access to services, client access to services. I've seen, for example, I mentioned the anti-ABA movement earlier. I have seen on social media countless posts or comments where a caregiver says their child was diagnosed with whatever developmental or intellectual disorder, and they say that they were recommended to do ABA services, but they're choosing not to do ABA services. And instead, they're going to opt for a less effective intervention or some other alternative, maybe a holistic approach or whatever it might be. They're going to opt for another form of intervention because they don't feel comfortable with the field of ABA or what they've heard about the field of ABA. So, for all of these different reasons, the perception of ABA matters, okay? So we want to make sure that we are doing what we can as a field to improve the perception of ABA. And one of those things that was mentioned as in Montrose's article that continues to be a concern is social validity. So that's what we're going to focus our attention on today. It is up to us as behavior analysts to ensure that our science is not only effective, but also understood, trusted, and valued. So let's learn a little bit more about that. So as Montrose was said, in behavior analysis, we should be incorporating some subjective measures of social validity. And he does mention, and I did mention earlier too, that we as a field tend to focus on objective measures. We are a data-driven field. We want to observe the behavior directly, conduct some manipulation of the environment, maybe conduct assessments. And we are constantly collecting data on our behavior to determine, when we implement a particular intervention, what is the effect of that intervention on the behavior? Did we produce meaningful change? Did we not? Well, if we didn't, then let's, modify the intervention a little bit and see what effect that produces, etc. So, within behavior analysis, we focus on those objective measures, those data-driven measures. And then the subjective measures that Montrose Wolf is proposing that we implement for social validity include conducting surveys, asking questions. Maybe it's like a free response or just an interview with the caregivers, or not just caregivers, with anybody, with the stakeholders. But we are going to be asking for people's opinions, for people's perceptions, we're going to be asking people questions about their values, what's important to them, how satisfied they are with something, whether they feel comfortable implementing something. We're just going to be asking them questions about how they perceive the goals that we're working on, the intervention, anything related to your ABA implementation, goal selection, etc. So that's the distinction between objective and subjective measurement. So with objective, we are actually sitting and collecting data on the behavior, we're observing the behavior, etc. Whereas with the subjective measures, it's more, we're just collecting the stakeholder's response, the client's responses, opinions on what they think, how they perceive the intervention, what they value, etc. So both of these are going to be critical to include in our interventions. Like I mentioned earlier, you're not going to have one and exclude the other. You cannot have a good quality ABA intervention and only have subjective measures. You cannot base your entire intervention just off of how people feel about the intervention, right? You cannot let this be the only guiding factor for your interventions. But you also cannot let the objective measures be the only thing that guide your intervention, because as I mentioned, you can have a wonderfully written behavior plan, a wonderfully written intervention, and if you did not consider your client's culture, your client's values, maybe their religious beliefs, whatever it might be, then they might be less likely to implement your intervention. So how does it benefit the client for you to have a beautiful intervention on paper that nobody is implementing? It won't benefit them. So a combination of these two measures is going to produce the best outcome for your clients. So when Montrose Wolf introduced the concept of social validity, into the field of ABA, he mentioned that he understood that these subjective measures of social validity don't come without some danger. Of course, utilizing subjective measures can produce unreliable results. And so when you ask for a person's opinion, when you ask for a person's perception on something, people's opinions, people's perceptions are going to vary greatly. It's going to vary maybe based off of where they are in a room, or whether one person is being an active participant or inactive participant. If we only were to base our decision making on subjective measures, then we would end up with unreliable results because we might have some inconsistent data or some inconsistent reporting. So we won't use this as our only form of decision making decision making process to move on. Additionally, he mentioned that one of the other dangers of using subjective measures was that there could be an influence of multiple variables, meaning that how a person responds like how they respond to, let's say, a survey or an interview could be influenced by their own personal biases. It could be influenced by something as simple as their mood. You might ask for somebody's opinion on an intervention, and maybe their mood had been affected in that particular day, and so you'll get a lower rating, let's say. So he understood that assessing social validity would also come with these pitfalls. He knew that people would have distorted responses from question phrasing. So depending on how you would phrase your particular question, you might be able to skew someone to respond in a particular way. You can embed basically your biases into those questions. And then that also these questionnaires or these interviews that where people were providing their opinion could end up limiting objectivity. Meaning that subjective measures may fail to capture observable, measurable behaviors, which would make it difficult to validate or replicate findings. Basically, what this means is that we might end up relying too heavily on these surveys, right, which don't provide, like I said, any measurable, observable data for us. And we might end up making making decisions on the intervention that are not data-based. And so it could limit our objectivity. We have to be careful. Like I said, it's a balance. You want to use the subjective measures, and then you also want to make sure that you are staying true to the evidence-based interventions that we should be implementing. So as I just mentioned, it's very important for us to balance subjectivity with objectivity, because this is going to allow us to deliver interventions that are not just behaviorally sound, but that are also meaningful to those individuals that we serve. That balance is going to be critical for achieving outcomes that enhance the quality of life of our clients, their stakeholders, their families, the community, etc. When social validity, like the incorporation of social validity or subjective measures, is done thoughtfully, we can use those subjective measures to guide our improvements to interventions and making them more effective and relevant. But as I mentioned, it's a balance. You have to make sure that you are incorporating those objective measures and those subjective measures in a way where you are still, making data-based decisions. So there are some ways that we can design our social validity assessments in a way that we would mitigate the risks, or basically make it less likely for us to rely solely on subjective measures rather than objective. So one way that we can mitigate the risks is to combine subjective measures with objective data. We could do this by pairing, for example, stakeholder feedback with observable and measurable data. And we can validate then those insights that we gather from the social validity assessments, and we can use that to strengthen the overall conclusion that we draw from our assessment. So this means that we could look at we can look at our data and then have some, let's say, survey that went along with the data, and we can see, okay, this person says that they feel the intervention has been effective and it has improved their quality of their life. Let's look at the data. What does the data show? And then we can see, the data does support this, or the data does not support this. Let me go back and ask them about X, Y, and Z. You told me that you feel this has produced a meaningful change in your life, but I see in the data that the behavior hasn't, gone up. Let's talk a little bit more about that. And then, you can use that to guide your intervention. But the idea here is to combine those subjective measures, those social validity assessments, along with the data that you're collecting, and look at those two together. Another thing that I guess a good practice to implement would be to design your social validity assessment in a way where we can minimize bias. You want to have your questions be written in as neutral and like basically you want to phrase them in as neutral of a way as possible. You don't want to lead your clients or your participants that are going to be filling out those surveys or engaging in those interviews with you. You don't want to lead them towards any particular response, but rather ask a more open-ended question that's going to help you to get an idea for maybe how they feel about an intervention. Because, for example, you can ask them, think about these two questions and how they're phrased. What if I said to you, I noticed that you don't particularly like the intervention. Tell me a little bit more about why you don't like the intervention. In that way, I'm phrasing the question in a negative way already. And so I'm leading the person to answer a question about why they don't like the intervention. Whereas I could ask the person the simple question. Tell me a little bit about the intervention and how you feel implementing it. Those two ways of phrasing the intervention, the questions are completely different. One is very negative, like it's leading the person to respond in a negative way, whereas the other is more neutral and open-ended. So, how we design our social validity assessments can really help us to produce a more, I guess to have less of a bias embedded into it. And then finally, we want to be transparent with our clients about the limitations of subjective feedback that they're providing us. You want to acknowledge that information that you're gathering from them is going to be influenced by their personal perceptions or their biases or etc. And that you will be combining, those subjective measures along with some data in order to get a better picture of what's going on or to be able to understand the context of what's going on. So anyways, if you were to implement these three things, if we were to address these three risks proactively, then we can really focus in on those strengths that subjective measures can provide us with, while also maintaining that rigor or integrity that we look for when we're providing behavior analytics services. So I've kind of already talked about this point, but I want to make sure I explicitly say it on a slide. Social validity is not the primary dependent variable of any intervention. It will be a dependent variable. It should be some factor that you consider and that we measure, but it's not gonna be the end all be all. As I mentioned, you need to make database decisions. There will be other dependent variables that we are measuring. And so the social validity assessments or the social validity questionnaires, interviews, surveys, whatever it might be that you're conducting, they're just going to be providing you with supplemental information to guide your intervention, goal selection, etc. So what is the process to follow when we are assessing social validity? The first step is just to collect information from the consumer about the program. And then the second step would be to use that information to guide the changes within your intervention. And there's a disclaimer here, you should be making database decisions as well. So review that data, see what it shows, and then making sure that whatever change you're producing to the intervention is also an evidence-based, intervention that you're implementing. Don't just put some random, thing. I don't know. I'm trying to think of. I don't think I can think of an example right now, but make sure that whatever intervention you're implementing or whatever change you're producing is something that is still behavior analytic in nature. So who do we include when we are assessing social validity? I've touched on this a little bit, but I want to review it formally. So the consumers who could be asked questions of social validity will include the direct consumers, which are those people that are participating directly in the intervention. There will be the indirect consumer, which are those people that are closely impacted by the intervention. So this could be, for example, primary caregivers, so mom, dad, siblings, anybody that lives at home with the client. Then we have the members of the immediate community. These are those individuals who interact with the direct or indirect consumers. So this could be, for example, the teacher, maybe extended family members, etc. And then we have members of the extended community, which are those individuals who live in the same community but don't interact with the direct or indirect consumers. So it's really just somebody in the community that may come across an individual, let's say at a shopping mall, at a park, etc. So they won't be directly impacted by the client and their interventions, but we can maybe the behaviors that the individual engages in are important and socially significant, to the members of the community. And so we can assess social validity in that way. So now that you have an understanding of what social validity is, why it's important, why we should assess social validity, etc., let's go back to the article from Ferguson et al. So as I mentioned, the initial article that was written on social validity was the Montrose and Wolf article, which was written in 1968. Okay, then in 1992, a behavior analyst named Kennedy conducted an analysis to report on the trends, to see the trends in social validity reporting. They basically wanted to see, well, how often are the different articles in JABA, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, reporting on social validity or mentioning social validity at all. And what they found was that in between 1968 to 1975, social validity was very rarely reported in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. And so then Carr et al., which were, other researchers, they published another article in 1989 about the same thing. They just wanted to see the trends in social validity reporting. And they found that there was not that there were very low reports on social validity, but that those reports on social validity began increasing during the mid-70s, 1970s, and there was a peak in reporting in 1983. And then after that, it remained steady, right? They reached a peak in reporting and then it remained steady. Well, unfortunately, I think it was still very low. Only 20% of the articles that were being published in JABA, in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, were reporting on social validity. And that is astoundingly low, considering everything that we've just talked about, the importance of social validity, how meaningful assessing social validity can be for clients, for the field, etc. So why are these findings of, only 20% of articles reporting on social validity, why is that troubling? Well, if some people's perceptions of our field are negative, why aren't we conducting more social validity assessments to inform the changes that could improve acceptability, right? Like if we know how these perceptions affect our field, we know that, when people have specific misconceptions about ABA, they're not going to seek out ABA services. When people have certain misconceptions about ABA practitioners, they're not going to want to collaborate with us. Then why aren't we, as behavior analysts or as a field, doing a better job of reporting on social validity or even assessing social validity, right? And not only for the field, this isn't just troubling for the field as a whole, but we also know that social validity, like if we were to assess social validity and make sure that, we have socially significant behavioral goals, that we know that our interventions are acceptable to our clients or appropriate to our clients, if we were to do all of these things, we know that our client is going to benefit immensely. So why are we not, as behavior analysts and as a field, why are we not reporting on this more consistently? The other troubling thing is that JABA, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, is the most common journal within our field, right? It's the most prominent journal in our field. It's the one that most people go to read about the new ABA interventions, or the most, it's the most prominent journal in our field. And so why is JABA not pushing researchers to conduct socially valid assessments? And then finally, JABA articles are the articles that are most commonly assigned to ABA students. And so this is what students are being exposed to articles that don't mention social validity. If only 20% of the articles back then were on social validity, then students were barely being exposed to discussion on social validity and social appropriateness, and making sure that you have a client-centered approach, or that you are considering cultural context and cultural values, right? That just shows you that the majority of the people in our field have barely had any background or training. I shouldn't say barely. I'll rephrase that. The majority of the people in our field, when we first got our education, most likely barely had exposure to the discussion on social validity and the assessment of social validity. That wasn't something that was commonly talked about in our field back then. And you can see that reflected in the journals. But we know how important social validity is, and so that's why some of these findings are very troubling. So the method for analysis was that they included articles in the analysis if there was at least one participant. If the article was a literature review or a commentary article, then they excluded it from the analysis. And then they collected data on articles that had social validity measures reported on, different types of social validity. They collected data on the social validity dimension, as well as the whether that article reported on using social validity in the future, or like reporting on social validity in the future, so as a future direction. So to get a sense for the amount of articles in JABA that were assessing social validity or mentioning social validity in any way, they scored the article in different ways. So articles were scored as including a social validity measure if the article included any qualitative or quantitative data on the social significance of the treatment goals. So if they mentioned anything about social significance of goals, then they were counted as, having assessed social validity or measured social validity in some way. If the article made mention of the social appropriateness of the interventions being implemented, then they were scored as, again, having measured social validity in some way. And finally, if the article mentioned the social importance of the outcomes or the effects of the intervention, then again, they were scored as having included some measure of social validity. And then this is the same way actually that the previous researchers had scored social validity. This article by Ferguson et al. Had one additional way that they counted social validity, and that was if the researchers in the article made any mention at all to an anecdotal report of social validity. So, for example, if they mentioned that parents made comments about the intervention or how they felt about the intervention, but maybe they didn't use the term social validity, then they counted that as a form of social validity. The authors also analyzed the dimensions across the different studies of social validity. So they wanted to know how many studies were reporting on the assessment of treatment goals, how many were reporting on the assessment of treatment procedures, and then how many were reporting on the assessment of the treatment effects. So the results were that they reviewed 1,334 JABA articles. Based off of those 1,334 articles, they excluded 125 articles because they didn't include at least one participant. So those 125 were likely commentary articles or literature review articles. And then they ended up with a database of 1,209 articles that were included in the analysis. Out of all of those 1,209 articles that did qualify or that did meet criteria, only 141 included some measure of social validity. So only 12%, what was this, from 1999 to 2016, included, only 12% of the articles published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis included some measure of social validity. That is lower than in 1983, I would say significantly lower, which points to a huge problem within our field, or maybe it's not within the field, but maybe it's in the journal itself, who knows. But this is the data that we have to go off of, and it's, I think, a very concerning data, I would say. So let's continue to review the data. This is a table that is provided within the article, the Ferguson article, and it lists the percentage of articles that reported on social validity between those years studied in the article. So from 1999 to 2016, these are the articles that report on social validity within JABA. And then the gray bars represent the, let me get my pointer out. The gray bars represent the total number of articles published per year that met that inclusion criteria. And then the this data path here represents the percentage of articles in which social validity was reported. So in total, for example, in this year, in 1999, I would say there were about, 55, maybe 58 articles published. And of those 58, fewer than 10% reported on social validity. The highest that we see here across all these years in reporting was in 2006. There were close to 60 articles published that met that criteria of including social validity. I'm sorry, of having at least one participant. And then of those articles, a little over 20% reported on social validity. And it's interesting to see that there was a spike here because there had been some drop off, in these years prior. And then there was a spike in 2006. I would be interested in knowing whether there was, like, maybe sometimes the journals ask researchers to, focus on a particular area of research or to include some measure. And so it's possible that they pushed for researchers to include like social validity measures in their studies. But who's to know what specifically caused this increase here? But it would be interesting to find out. Anyways, very astonishing numbers, I would say. And I think we need to do a better job as a field. So like I said, only 12% of the articles in JABA reported on social validity measures from 1999 to 2016. And then I have some data for you guys, and this is in the article, but I have some data on the most common types of social validity assessments that were conducted. Primarily, the researchers reported a combination of assessments being conducted, which is just a combination of any of these. And then the others, 21% reported using a rating scale, 17% reported using questionnaires, 6% reported providing, choice of which intervention maybe the caregivers wanted to implement or the client themselves wanted to implement. And then the other 8% just reported social validity measures in some way, whether it was anecdotal or some other form of assessing for social validity. Out of the 141 articles, that were reporting on social validity measures. 85% reported on the measure of social validity of procedures used during treatment. 60% reported on the social validity of treatment effects. So how effective were those treatments? How effective do you feel the intervention was? Do you feel that the behavior could be improved further, etc. 12% reported on the social validity of the treatment goals. So this is that social significance. They found that very few of those people that were reporting were even assessing the social significance of goals. Most people were doing a really good job, I think, of incorporating people's opinions during the treatment phase, which is great to see. But we can get started from very early on, from the goal selection. We should be assessing social significance of goals. Okay, and then let's see how many people were included social validity as a future direction. This means that how many people mentioned that they would like to assess social validity in the future. So out of 1,068 articles that did not report, 42 out of 1,068 articles that didn't report social validity measures suggested it as a future direction. So about 4% of the articles published in JABA ended up, maybe they didn't do any of these formal social validity measures, but they did mention that they would be interested maybe in assessing social validity in the future if they were to conduct that intervention again. So only 4% of the articles published in JABA during that time frame, this time frame here, reported that they would be interested in assessing social validity in the future. And then 30 out of the 141 that reported on social validity also mentioned it as a future direction. So 21%. So of course, I think these are very astonishing results. I would like to see the field implementing social validity measures, assessing social validity more often. I think it's good practice. We are seeing a bigger movement within our field towards, like a client-centered approach, making sure that we're taking into consideration our clients' wants, our clients' needs, that we are gathering assent from our clients. We are seeing a bigger move towards culturally appropriate interventions, that we are incorporating our clients' values into our intervention, or their caregivers' values, the stakeholders' values, that we're basically tailoring our interventions to our individual clients' needs, not just from a behavioral perspective, right? Not just from you're engaging in this problem behavior and the function is X, Y, and Z, and I know exactly what intervention is perfect for this, but rather this is the function of your behavior. I have an intervention that can be effective for this, but I also have all of these other options of interventions that can be effective. Let's find the one that's the best fit for your family, for your client, for your needs. I think we need to be doing a better job than just 12%. So I hope in the upcoming years, someone else conducts an analysis and reports on the trends in social validity in JABA. And I would like to see an increase in that number in the future. And I think we will. Just, anecdotally, I've been seeing a lot more talk about these different topics in our field. There are tons of practitioners that had no experience or no knowledge, not knowledge, I shouldn't say knowledge, but they didn't get a lot of training on this during grad school or during undergrad, that are now getting a lot more exposure to this through their continuing education events. They're trying to do better, I think, as practitioners. I think our field in general is trying to do better. And so, I hope that we can make a move towards applying more socially valid interventions. So that leads me to our one of our last slides. So applying social validity to behavior change goals. Will help us to identify socially significant goals, which is what matters most to our clients and our stakeholders. It will help us to make client-informed decisions, meaning that we should be involving our clients in goal setting to increase buy-in, And then it will lead us to culturally responsive practices, and we'll be respecting and integrating cultural values and norms into our interventions. So, summary and future directions. Social validity is critical, and it is an underreported component in ABA, unfortunately. But when we know better, we should do better. You guys are students in the field, and I think you're in a very unique position to help, get our fields into a better place. Try to reduce some of those misconceptions by really putting forward our best foot. You have the knowledge. We're arming you with the knowledge. It's now your role to make the field better. And that sounds like a lot of pressure, but really to go out there and do your best as practitioners. If you're seeing something that's not correct or that could be done in a better way, you should be trying to, do things in a better way. If you're seeing an intervention where, maybe your supervisor is not incorporating cultural values, you can suggest it to them. Hey, let's consider this client's culture. What's relevant to them? Is it important? Is X, Y, and Z important to them? Maybe this is why they're not following through with the intervention. I think you guys are in a unique position because you're learning about all of these topics while you're in grad school. You are able to build your foundation as a behavior analyst with all of these really useful tools already from the get-go, whereas we, the behavior analysts that have been in this field for years, didn't start hearing about these topics until much later into our career. And so we had to relearn a lot of different things. And there are still people that are not being exposed to these topics. And, practitioners that have been in our field 10, 15, 20 years that don't have a ton of experience with this and are having to relearn a lot of the ways that we practice as behavior analysts, just so that we can do better by our clients, so that we are implementing socially valid interventions. So I hope that this lecture helps you. It helps kind of set the scene for the interventions that you're going to be exposed to throughout this course and in the upcoming courses. You're going to learn about very effective interventions, very good quality evidence-based interventions. But I want you to know that ABA is not just like a math equation. This is the function of the problem behavior, and this is the intervention that goes along with it. There's so many other factors to consider, and I think that when you're getting this information at the beginning, of your careers, it's better so that you're not having to relearn everything or reframe, what you've learned in the past. So, anyways, incorporate your client feedback so that you can, tailor their interventions to them, so that you can tailor their goals to them, etc. And then future research should emphasize cultural responsiveness and more consistent use of social validity measures. I hope this helps you in, when you're reviewing the upcoming interventions that we'll be covering in this course, so you can see them in a different light. And here are the references for the articles discussed in this presentation.